Hello and welcome to the new season of the Drawn and Redrawn, the Making of India's Internal Boundaries podcast. This is a part of a larger India State Stories project that explores the evolution of India's political and administrative boundaries. This project is an undertaking by the Centre for Legislative Education and Research at Flame University in Pune. In this new season, we embark on a journey through the fascinating histories and narratives of each Indian state and union territories, exploring the pivotal events, influential personalities, and societal transformations that have shaped the subcontinent. In the 15th episode, we learn about the intriguing yet often less explored history of the formation of current Union territory of Lakshadweep Islands. This episode is based on a corresponding article written by our team at India State Stories. These articles have been converted to audio conversations with the help of Google's Notebook LM. You can find the relevant article link in the show notes. Now, let's dive into the conversation.
When we usually talk about Indian states, we're talking about these massive land masses, millions of people, borders that have shifted over centuries. But today, we're zooming in, way in.
Hey, it's a huge change of scale, isn't it? We're looking at a cluster of tiny specks in the Arabian Sea, India's smallest union territory.
Exactly, Lakshadweep. And I have to admit, before digging into all this research, the historical archives, the States Reorganization Commission reports, all the recent news, my mental image was, it was pretty one-dimensional.
Pristine beaches, coral reefs.
Expensive vacations, yeah.
Yeah.
But the story here is just incredibly dense. I mean, it's got accidental discoveries by ancient kings, a colonial administration that was, frankly, a bureaucratic nightmare, and a really high-stakes geopolitical decision in 1956 that essentially prioritized naval strategy over, local governance.
That 1956 decision is really the anchor of this whole story. It's the moment the map kind of freezes, but you're right. To get why that decision was made, we have to understand that Lakshadweep has never just been a vacation spot. It's always been strategic.
So our mission today is to figure out how these 36 islands went from being what the sources call a search party accident to this major flashpoint for the debate on federalism versus local autonomy.
And just to set the scene, we're looking at 36 islands scattered about, 200 to 400 kilometers off the coast of Kerala.
Right. And while we say scattered, there is a method to it. They're actually divided into 3 distinct subgroups, and this is crucial for the history.
It really is. You've got the Amindivi group in the north, the Lakshadweep group in the middle, and then Minicoy way down south. That physical separation created a historical separation that lasted for centuries.
Okay, let's rewind all the way back. The search party accident. The source material kicks off with this amazing legend about Chairman Perumal, the king of Kerala. It honestly reads like the opening of an adventure movie.
It really does. So the legend and historians have debated the specifics, but the narrative is really strong in the local tradition, is that the Chera king, Chairman Perumal, just disappeared from Kerala. Vanished. There are different stories about why, but the key part for us is that his people sent out search parties. They launched these sailing boats into the Arabian Sea to find their king.
And navigation back then wasn't exactly GPS enabled?
Not even close. So one of the search parties, sailing from modern-day Kannur, gets caught in this just a terrible storm. They're blown completely off course, battered by the sea, and eventually they shipwreck.
And they wash up on
a mini island.
The mini island.
Yeah, which is in that northern Amindivi group we just mentioned. So they went looking for a king and found an archipelago instead.
That's incredible.
And that's said to be the first settlement. What's fascinating is that this accident tied the islands to the mainland's cultural sphere right from the start. They were settled by Malayalis.
But once people are living there, the islands become a prize, right? It's not an isolated utopia.
Not at all. Everyone wants a piece of this real estate. The timeline shows the Kadambaris of Goa capturing Kavaratti in the 10th century.
And then the Chola dynasty comes in during the medieval period. Then the kingdom of Kannur.
Exactly. It just goes to show these islands were never truly remote in a political sense. They were always connected to the trade routes and power dynamics of the mainland. If you controlled the coast, you wanted to control the islands.
But the big shift, the one that really sets up the modern confusion, happens when the islands come under the Muslim House of Arakal. This is where the map starts to get really complicated.
Fractured is the perfect word for it. To understand why Lakshadweep is the way it is today, you have to look at the deal between Tipu Sultan and the British. This is the late 18th century.
Right. The sources mention the Amindidi Islands, the northern group, were ceded to Tipu Sultan.
Yes, in 1787. But then Fast forward just a bit to 1799, the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. Tipu Sultan falls,
And the British East India Company sweeps in and annexes his territories.
including the Amindigo Islands. Now, here is where you see this sort of bureaucratic convenience kick in. The British needed somewhere to administer these northern islands from, and since they had just taken Mangalore,
They just lumped them together.
they just lumped them together. They governed the northern islands from Mangalore, which is in South Canara.
Okay, so if I'm living in the north, my government office is in Mangalore. What about the rest? The Lakshadweep and Minicoy Islands.
Well, they remained under the House of Arakal, but as was the British way, there was a catch.
A tribute.
A very heavy tribute. The House of Arakal had to pay the British a significant sum just to keep their own islands.
And let me guess, the payment was always late.
Consistently. The British claimed the tributes were in arrears, so they used that unpaid debt as a justification to first sequester and then eventually annex the southern islands too.
Okay, but here's the twist then. Instead of grouping them with the northern islands they already had,
They attached these southern islands to the Malabar district, which was under the Madras presidency.
that is wildly confusing.
A total mess.
So you have one set of islands ruled from Mangalore and the other set ruled from Malabar. They're reporting to two different headquarters in two different districts.
Precisely. And this administrative schizophrenia, it just persisted right up until independence. Culturally similar people speaking the same language, but governed by two completely different colonial desks.
Which brings us to the big pivot point. 1947 comes and goes, but the real reshaping happens in 1956. We've talked about the States Reorganization Commission, the SRC, and other deep dives. This was the moment India took a red pen to the map to fix this exact kind of colonial mess.
Absolutely. 1955 and 56 were chaotic years for Indian map-making, and the SRC's primary mandate was to organize states on linguistic lines. Language was the glue.
So they looked at the map of the South. They recommended merging Malabar with the new state of Kerala, merging South Canara with Mysore, which became Karnataka.
Exactly. So logically, where do the islands go? The SRC looked at it and said, look, let's keep it simple. The people speak Malayalam, the culture is Malayali, just merge all the islands, Amindivi, Lakshadweep, Minicoy, into the new state of Kerala.
It makes total sense on paper. Administrative efficiency, cultural unity. It seems like a done deal. But
it didn't happen, and this is where the story shifts from, administrative cleanup to high-stakes strategy. The central government in New Delhi looked at the SRC recommendation and just said, no.
we're taking the islands.
Yes, we're taking them.
Why? I mean, the government was usually trying to consolidate things to save money and effort. Why keep these tiny specks of land separate and take on the headache of ruling them directly?
Well, according to the archives, there were two critical reasons, and neither had anything to do with culture. It was about survival and ideology.
Okay.
First, the strategic angle. The diplomat and historian K.M. Panikkar had written about this back in 1951. He was looking at the Indian Ocean not just as water, but as a security zone.
He saw them as what, like unsinkable aircraft carriers?
In a sense, yes. Panikkar argued that the islands were vital for India's long-term naval interests. If you control the islands, you control the shipping lanes. The feeling in Delhi was that these assets were just too strategically valuable to be a remote district of a state. They needed direct federal oversight.
Okay, so national security was pillar one. What was pillar two?
Political anxiety. Specifically, anxiety about the color red.
The communist.
Correct. In the mid-50s, the communist movement in Kerala was gaining serious traction. There was a very real possibility, which actually came true in 1957, that Kerala would elect a communist government.
So the tenor was worried that if they handed the islands to Kerala, they'd be handing a strategic naval asset to a communist state government.
Exactly. You have to remember, this was the Cold War era. The center wanted to sort of firewall the islands from that specific political ideology. They wanted to insulate them.
So to keep them secure and to keep them, well, politically aligned with the center, they took direct control.
That's the long and short of it. So with the States Reorganization Act of 1956, the Union territory of Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and Amindivi Islands was created, placed directly under the President of India.
Wow. Talk about a mouthful of a name.
It took them until August 26, 1973, to finally shorten it to just Lakshadweep.
So we have this Union territory status born out of strategy and political caution. But what does that actually mean for the people living there? I mean, living in a UT is so different from living in a state. No chief minister, no state assembly.
You have an administrator appointed by the president. It's a very top-down model. And for a long time, the locals had very little say in how they were governed. However, the sources do highlight a big shift in 1994 with the Lakshadweep Panchayati Regulation Act.
Right, this brought the Panchayati Raj system to the islands. But how does that work for a whole territory?
It's a unique two-tier system. At the local level, you have the Dweep Panchayat. Across the islands, there are about 79 members in these bodies dealing with village issues.
Okay.
Then above that, you have a singular district panchayat, which has one member representing each island.
So this did give the local population a voice, a mechanism to manage their own affairs?
It gave them a voice. Absolutely. It allowed them to manage local development, education, health. But, and this is the tension that really defines Lakshadweep politics, the ultimate power still rests with the administrator. The panchayat can advise, they can pass resolutions, but the administrator holds the keys.
Speaking of voices, though, we can't talk about Lakshadweep's political history without mentioning PM Saeed. The source material paints him as a titan of island politics.
Titan is the right word. PM Saeed was a Congress leader, but he was more than that. He was the face of Lakshadweep in New Delhi. He represented the islands in parliament for 10 consecutive terms.
10 terms, that's almost 40 years.
From 1967 all the way to 2004. You have to understand, Lakshadweep only has one seat in the Lok Sabha, just one MP. If that MP changes every few years, they never build up seniority or clout. Saeed stayed so long, he became a heavyweight. He could walk into a ministry in Delhi and get things done.
Things like harbor projects, electrification, schools.
All of it. He really put the islands on the national radar.
So for a long time, there was this delicate balance. You had the administrator sent from the center, you had the panchayats managing local stuff, and a strong representative in Delhi smoothing things over.
It was a balance. But recently, that balance tipped. The sources bring us to the events of 2021, which they describe as a clash between national agendas and local resistance.
And this centers around the reforms proposed by the administrator at the time, Praful Patel. It seems like things went from 0 to 100 very, very quickly.
They really did. The administrator introduced a series of draft regulations that triggered widespread protests, not just in the islands, but in Kerala and all over social media. And when you look at the list of changes, you can see why it felt like shock therapy to the locals.
Okay, let's break them down. The source list changes to land use, diet, and policing.
Right. So first, there was the proposed ban on beef. Now, in a population that is almost entirely Muslim and where beef is a standard part of the diet, banning it was seen as a direct disregard for their culture. Then there were changes to land use regulations that would allow the administration to take over land for development purposes much more easily.
In a place where land is incredibly scarce, that must have been terrifying for locals.
Land is everything there. And then perhaps the most controversial was the PSSA, the Prevention of Antisocial Activities Regulation.
The Gunda Act.
Exactly, which allows for detention without trial for up to a year.
But wait, looking at the data, doesn't Lakshadweep have one of the lowest crime rates in India? Why did they need a Gunda Act?
That was precisely the argument of the protesters. They were asking, where are the Gundas? The administration's argument was that these were necessary steps to modernize the islands, boost tourism, ensure security. But the locals, and again, I'm just reflecting the sentiments in the reports here, saw it as an attempt to destroy their way of life and ecology for corporate tourism.
It really highlights the fundamental issue with the union territory model, doesn't it? When you have an administrator who isn't elected by the people he governs, there's no feedback loop.
That's the core debate the sources are pointing to. It highlights the limitations of that top-down model. How much say should the people of a strategic union territory have in their own future? Is it a military asset first, or is it a home first?
And that question of home is becoming so literal because the source material ends on a pretty serious note about the environment. I mean, we can fight about laws, but the land itself is under threat.
This is the ticking clock. We are talking about coral atolls. These are not mountains. They are basically piles of sand and coral sitting just a few meters above sea level. They are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, rising sea levels, coral bleaching.
So when the administration pushes for development, bigger resorts, more ships, wider roads, it's not just an aesthetic choice, it's an existential risk.
Precisely. The source explicitly says that the future depends on policies that respect the cultural, ecological, and political specificities of the archipelago. If you dredge the lagoons for big ships, you might kill the coral. If the coral dies, the natural breakwater against the ocean disappears. The island washes away.
It's a tightrope walk. You need development, you need jobs, but the wrong kind of development just ends the story entirely.
And that brings us right back to that idea of boundaries we started with.
Which is a perfect setup for our final thought. We've covered the search party, the colonial confusion, the strategic separation from Kerala, and the modern political storm. What's the one thing you want our listener to walk away thinking about today?
Well, we often think of boundaries as lines on a map that define who we are. But in the case of Lakshadweep, the boundary was drawn not just around land, but around a strategic idea, keeping it separate for naval security. But here's the provocation. As the climate crisis worsens, the question isn't just about who governs the islands. The question is whether our rigid administrative boundaries are flexible enough to save a fragile ecosystem from disappearing entirely.
That's a heavy but necessary question. It really puts the whole strategy versus survival debate into perspective. The map might not matter if the land isn't there. Thank you so much for breaking this down with us today. It's been a fascinating deep dive into a part of India that, it often gets talked about as a tourist destination, but rarely as a complex political entity.
It was a pleasure. It is a story that definitely deserves to be heard.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this deep dive. Check the show notes for the link to the original article if you want to read more. We'll catch you on the next one.